Hi, my name is Wendy Gunter. I'm a speech pathologist, and I'll be talking today about speech generating devices and factors that you can consider when starting to trial for a student or patient. Sharon, I don't see my slides. Does that mean they're not up? Or
They're up. I think you're just scroll down. I think they're up above.
sorry.
There you
So I don't have anything to disclose. I have no financial or non-financial relationships with any of the vendors. So one thing to consider when starting to trial devices is resources that you can use to borrow them, because of course the whole point of a trial is like test driving a car to see if it's a good match for the patient or student's needs. There's often ESD or regional services that have a library. In the Portland area, Columbia Regional Orthopedic Services provides those. And often you can trial multiple ones in sequence, so it wouldn't be uncommon to be able to trial 3 or 4 in a 6-month period. Often districts own some devices outright, or the clinic or hospital that you work for can also be a way to access a device without having to pay for it. Every state in the U.S. has a Center for Excellence for, you said, a Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities. And so in Oregon has 2, OHSU and U of O has them, but every state has one, and they all have lending libraries that you can access. Another way is to just network within a community, especially with smaller communities, with word of mouth. In Eastern Oregon last year, I was able to find one just by asking around. A mom had one that her son wasn't using anymore. He became verbal, and so there was one that we were able to use to borrow in order to find out if that was a good match. And then the vendors also will often allow you to trial the device, either by having the sales rep come to you and the patient, or sometimes like the Dream Loan with Dynavox, where you can fill out an application and have them send it to you for a short-term loan. Another factor to consider is the caregivers. So parents or people that are involved in this person's life can often provide a really detailed history that helps you out. They'll know what's been tried, even if it's not in a medical record, or even if the patient has had services several places, they can often say what's worked well and what hasn't. I had a mom a couple weeks ago tell me that her son had used a Big Mac switch, and even though there wasn't one in his current classroom, the classroom that he had come from, he had done well with the Big Mac, and so that was a great starting point. Caregivers can also give you really great information just about themselves. Often they're the person who is going to be the one programming and supporting that device. And so you can often start to judge what might be a good match for the entire family or the entire support system of the person who needs a speech generating device. I had a mom last year who really was challenged by some things like sending me email attachments with photos, and was a little overwhelmed with some more technological aspects of our communication. And so then that helped me know that if it was going to be a system that she supported, it needed to be one that was a little more transparent, or maybe had better supports in place for programming. It's a great opportunity too, when you talk with caregivers, to address myths and misconceptions. Most parents really live with a fear that if their child makes that leap into a speech generating device, that they'll become lazy or never learn to talk. So it's a really good point to do some education for them on how they can really enhance their child's communication rather than hinder it. I think you can really get a deeper appreciation for the personality and preferences of an individual by talking with the caregivers. I had a student out in the Clackamas area, and At school, she was very reserved, but when talking with her mom about when she communicated, she actually had girlfriend sleepovers and girl beach trips and really enjoyed the girly social language. And so it actually led us to try a tango, which had more embedded whole social phrases in it, and it ended up being a good match. It was actually the one that we ended up choosing for her. And I think if we hadn't talked with mom, we wouldn't have known that strength about her, and that she was much more driven to use that than many we had trialed there at the school. Another consideration is your motor team. So for those of us in communication, we really need to stick within our scope of practice, and that means talking to other team members about access. You know, is this a good candidate for direct select? Do we have a step scanner? What type of device do we need to support the type of access? That is this an eye gaze for selection type student, or is this not a good match that way and they need something that they can get with a head pointer? Also, equipment tends to be within the motor team specialty. So do they need a daisy mount for their wheelchair, or a kickstand, or a rubber mat underneath? Those are all things that they can start to help address so that your trial is as effective as possible. Positioning is another thing that the motor specialists can use. So if you have a student that's primarily on the floor or stationary or not ambulatory, you can start to match with their strengths and look to the whole system there. Portability, what can the student carry? How big of a device can they be expected to carry around? Those are another good question for your motor team. And then just other specialists. So like I've been talking with the vision specialist for a high school student that I served this year. And you know, what size do we need for them to be able to really be able to visually regard this icon? What color background is going to give them the most contrast so they can really build that symbolism? So relying on your team is a good thing. Another thing to consider, and this falls squarely on us, is the communication skills. Often you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can look at the most recent language assessment, previous documentation from prior clinicians that talks about things that devices that have been trialed in the past and were successful. One time I didn't have to go any farther than that. I found that the family a year and a half prior to me engaging with the student had what everyone considered a very successful trial with a Tobii eye gaze system, and no factors had changed in the meantime. Everyone still felt that was the best device, and so I didn't actually have to do any assessment at all. It was just then became an issue of pursuing funding. You would expect that the more effective assessments for a pre-verbal student or child would be functional ones. For those of you that are familiar with the communication matrix or the school function assessment, that will probably do a better job of helping you answer the questions of what does this person need to be able to communicate well in a very functional way. Looking at all the different contexts, home, school, vocational training, becomes very important. And then also you want to look at speech sound production, because of course that's going to be one of those factors that helps you with justification. So if you have a student, I had one last year with trisomy 8, and the prognosis for him becoming verbal was very low. So then that helped me know right off the bat that we were really strongly looking at a speech generating device, and then that he was not likely to become verbal in the near future. Prior assessments will help you quite a bit too. Like I mentioned, the medical diagnosis, if there's something overriding, that might give you a really good clue about which device to trial, or just reinforce the team's decision to move forward on trialing devices. That's often where you'll find information about prior trials, as well as cognitive and vision issues that you may need to consider. I think when you're considering trialing a speech generating device, it's really important to think about um, there's some plurality there. You don't have to choose one device and give up the whatever they're using as a means. So if you have a student who's, I had one last year who was really proficient at texting and Facebooking using like social media um, means for communication, but it didn't help him at all with face-to-face interactions. Well, it was really important to know then that he didn't have to give up those things in order to gain something else. But we were looking at the areas of weakness. He really um, did not communicate out in the community, like to order food. In the classroom, he didn't communicate with his classmates in conventional means. So while he was functioning really well in some ways, he had some really glaring deficits where that speech generating device could step in and close that gap. So you may want to look at keeping the current system and then moving into a new one. You also want to start to really anticipate future needs. So it's very dynamic. What the student has needed in the past might not match what they need right now, and then also might take some leaps to go into the future. So many students won't get funded for a device in the next 5 years. So you want it to match their potential growth and what you anticipate their needs to be so that it is dynamic and changes with them and their growth. Another thing to consider that I've just ended up finding to be very helpful is to really recruit the team's enthusiasm and buy-in as you're trialing these devices so that it doesn't feel like you're coming in after the fact and saying this is the one that's going to work, but instead creating opportunities for everyone on the team, caregivers, teachers, special ed teachers, to see what choices there are and give their input into the process so that they become enthusiastic and supportive of it. One thing I've done several times is to just get pizza in the evening, invite the team and the parents and the student, and then just have an experience where they can touch and feel. For those of us who do this for quite a bit, I think we take for granted how much we know and how intimidating that is for someone who hasn't had experience with an effective speech augmentative communication user, and so they don't really even have a way to conceptualize what we're talking about. So having some time where they can just mess with the buttons and know they aren't screwing anything up and see how heavy this one is and how light this one is really helps with them being able to experience things and know what you're talking about. Being inclusive of the whole team at that point is really important. You don't really end up knowing who your champion might be. It might end up being the classroom teacher is the person that really drives that momentum, or sometimes the parent is the one that then pulls everybody else along. So you don't want to be the lone crusader on that. Giving them a time to ask questions, a really safe environment where everyone's asking questions, and sometimes I'll ask some genuine questions I have myself related to that student and a particular device. If like the sales rep is there or the augmentative specialist. It's also an opportunity for education. So if you think that the student might be going towards MinSpeak, a PRC device, you know, that's a good time to give, hey, this is why it's made the way it is, and wow, here's what's great about this type of device. What do you think? Push those buttons. What do you think? And I think because it encourages dialogue and problem solving, you are much more likely to end up with a device that is actually used and that people support in their environment. So I did put funding last because ethically we can't put it first. I have run across more than one situation where a student or child was in a very suboptimal system or no system, and it's because the team put the funding question first and didn't, rather than looking for the right match and what the student needs, they just got stalled out at that question of how are we going to pay for this? While that's important, and it's certainly something you have to overcome, that doesn't supersede that individual's right to communicate. And I think one of my favorite things to refer to is the Communication Bill of Rights. And it talks about how it doesn't matter how severe your disability is, you have that right to request objects and refuse undesired things and receive information and be respected as an individual and treated with courtesy and have an appropriate communication system. And so I think we really disregard that if we are first asking how we're going to pay for it and then not follow up on really finding that good match. I also think it is very hard to say no. If when you have that moment where you're like, oh my gosh, look at what this kid is saying that they couldn't say, everyone's very driven to figure out how to pay for it. And so finding that perfect match then makes it so that everyone is on board with figuring out how to find the funding. Of course, that doesn't mean we aren't concerned about it. So if you're an Oregon resident, keeping an eye on the Public Utilities Grant is a great one. That is very quick and easy when those funds open up. Health insurance, even if the child attends a public school, that doesn't mean that the family doesn't want to use their health insurance in order to fund the device. And in fact, most parents would prefer that it's paid for that way so that the student owns it, the student has it on breaks. There isn't a question of sometimes having access to communication and other times not, that they really are invested and want that. There's also long-term loans. So if you go back to that first slide that talks about places that you might borrow one, a lot of those sometimes have long-term loans. So that's another possibility. And then working with the vendors themselves. Obviously, they're motivated to make a sale. So when you found that right one, they can often be your best ally in knowing the latest and greatest on where to find resources in your community. I think it's important to know too that even though we've gotten to the end of this and you can tell that like you might have a device by the time you're done with this process, that technology alone doesn't make a functional communicator. And so actually the point that you get the device is the beginning of a huge journey, instead of like, oh, we got it, phew, we're done. Like, here, have this thing and we're done. That's actually when your most intensive periods of treatment begin. So I think I'll pop over to questions.
The first one is Barbara from Montana.
Oh, thanks. Okay. Is there a list of specific questions you want answered when trialing different devices? How do I compare apples and oranges? Oh, yeah. Yes, I do go through a specific list of questions, and I actually have it driven by my justification report. So all those factors of access, vision, cognitive skills. So as I'm trialing, I actually have found, I've probably done this 3 or 4 times now, and now I wouldn't do it any other way. So I set up a Google Doc so that everybody on the team can contribute. And then rather than getting to the end of all the trials and then saying, oh, now we got to write the report, we actually go do it as we go. So then as things occur to you, or as you have a really good treatment session with a particular device, you're just plugging that information in. You can find examples of justification reports on like Dynavox's website. They're pretty accessible, but letting that kind of drive. So I have also, confession, I had the opposite situation of having the trial be done and quick and over, and it went back and I didn't have some of my questions answered. So it was humbling to then go ask for it again. So yeah, it's really important to know which criteria you're setting out to find. And I think some of that is driven by the type of devices that you're trialing. So it's both the student skills and also which things you just ruled out right away for a certain reason. So there's a little bit of a match there. What are typical barriers for family acceptance of a trial? Um, I think the two barriers that I've found are one, the family being kind of overwhelmed by the technology. Um, if it's a family that has fewer resources in general, I find that that idea can be fairly overwhelming. So a family that um, I'm thinking of a family where the student's mother had passed away, dad was a day worker, grandma was the primary caregiver in the home, and they didn't leave home much. And he didn't have a lot of experiences outside the community, and the family themselves didn't have a lot of technology in the home. So I think that technology can kind of be a barrier if it's a family that's not comfortable themselves. I think that's becoming less and less of an issue, but I think that's still an issue. And then family acceptance of the trial. I I'd say the other thing is just that really primal fear that families have that if their student gets a speech generating device that they won't ever talk, as opposed to seeing it as a means for building communication so that if they do talk, they've built their language up. So that I tend to give them some research if it's a more sophisticated family, or talk it through depending on what level of information and trust we have built. Um, and what do I tell families to look for during a trial? I I'm usually pretty honest. I will tell them if I don't know, like I don't know which one's going to be a good match, or I have a hunch that you're going to like this one, or I tend to be pretty transparent and say things like, "Gosh, I don't know, this may be too big for him, but let's see how he does." I think the other thing is families are almost always willing to try, and that's the nice part of a trial. You aren't jumping in with both feet. You're saying, hey, what happens if we have this for a week or 2 weeks, or like the Dream Loan 4 weeks? What is going to happen that's great, and what are we going to see as challenges that we need to overcome? So Barbara, I hope that answered your question well. And then Jamie from Oregon writes, I've been wondering about how the iPad Kindle markets are affecting the speech generating device vendors. I haven't asked. I have, I think at some point the iPad Kindle devices will be better, but for most recently, I have found that there's still enough challenges with them that they don't always, while they're less expensive, there are still some challenges out there. Um, for example, I did Toby, which we all respect, has the Sonoflex Lite, and I don't know if anybody else tried that. But after 20 messages, no, 20, it ended up being 20 hits, not even 20 messages. It then defaults to, this is the trial of Toby Sonoflex Lite. Well, 20 hits is nothing. And then you have to totally restart it. Well, okay. So then I bought the full version. It still had a number of those same limitations and glitches. And to me, you have to have a really reliable system, and I think that's one of the things that dedicated devices have. Um, I also think I've seen issues with still the language and the ability to custom program. So the apps tend not to have the depth that a dedicated device does. So if you're trying to build a really rich vocabulary and a number of layers to your screens, sometimes the the child's communication can be limited by that type of device, which we never, right, that's self-defeating. So you want to have a system that's reliable and that supports every communication that the child is capable of, every act that they're capable of doing. And then Marianne from Seattle. Okay, if I'm new to working with devices, will the USAID be able to educate me on the different options to consider? You bet. Um, Typically, the ones that I've talked to will give you a quick phone consultation. You can kind of give them a rundown on the student and they'll help. Bigger districts will have an augmentative communication specialist that can come alongside you and support you in the trial. Vendors themselves I've found to be really helpful. They will problem solve and kind of help you figure out where is the best place to start, because that can often be overwhelming. And also when they're seeing a good match or some troubleshooting, they'll often be able to help. So I hope that helps, Marianne. And then Julie from Alaska. Do you see acceptance and demand for devices with iPads and tablets being all the rage? Seems everyone thinks a tablet will solve all concerns. Yes, I would say that I have run into that. I had a little boy who's a first grader on the autism spectrum, and his mom and I had had several conversations during the school year, and then one day he showed up with an iPad, and because we hadn't gone through that trialing process, she had found some funds and snapped them up really quickly, and I totally applaud her for going for it. But I also think because we weren't able to be thoughtful about the strengths and weaknesses and what was a good match for him and what might be challenging for him, he ended up with a device that was very hard to support. It was much harder than some of the other things we might have chosen for him. So yeah, I totally see the temptation, and Julie, I'm with you. I see that it's all the rage, and I think it will go that direction, but I'd say the jury's still out, or there's still a little more work to be done before iPads and tablets are really commensurate with a dedicated speech generating device. So, okay, so I think that's it, unless there's any more questions. Thank you for coming today, and I appreciate your questions.